Heads up, the following podcast contains adult language and deals with adult subjects. Keep this in mind as you listen, and you don't want to miss it. Today, Grace is talking with Alison Moore, a Swedenborgian pastor recovering from the fundamentalism of the same church and helping it progress. A dual citizen of the U.S. and Canada, an entrepreneur empowering other women and helping people quite literally get their shift together. On with the show.
Hey folks, I'm Grace.
And I'm James. Welcome to Fundamental Shift, the podcast where we explore the major shakeups in our lives, their fault lines, and aftershocks.
Thanks for listening. You're in for a real shift show. We'd like to let everyone know we're continuing with our hashtag FSP focus on food. We got some good feedback on decolonizing our tables over Thanksgiving. As the holiday season approaches with Hanukkah, Yuletide, Christmas, and Kwanzaa, we will be celebrating the thread that runs through all of these traditions, the spirit of giving. Knowing that so many people suffer from food poverty, we'll be highlighting how we can give back now and throughout the year. Keep a lookout on the socials for all kinds of resources and recommendations. We invite you to post about your holiday table using the hashtag FSPFocus.
So for our listeners, just want to let them know how we met. We met in the Latter-day Lesbian podcast discussion group, that is a mouthful, even they say it is.
Yep.
On Facebook. After you commented on my episode 37, Christianity Casserole, I want to be her friend, which I thought was awesome. So I messaged you back, and we decided to chat and try to get to know each other a little bit. And over the course of several long conversations, I have been honored to hear a lot of your story. And one thing that has really, I think, propelled our conversations and our friendship is our willingness to kind of just jump right in. So let's do just that.
Okay.
I like to say that my friends are the kind that talk about the things you're not supposed to discuss in polite society. And that has held true for us. So let's start with religion. Why not?
Let's do it.
So tell us about your religious background and what the heck a Swedenborgian is.
Well, Swedenborgians.
Pardon?
Yeah.
Not like the Borg Trekkies.
No, though I think we are the Borg. You will be assimilated would be a funny T-shirt. Though I'm not actually very colonial in my thinking, so you know, it's funny but not funny. So So Swedenborgianism. I mean, I don't want this to be about Swedenborgianism, but it's very, very small. It has not become big. It started around the same time as Methodism, if I'm right. And everybody's heard of a Methodist, but almost nobody's heard of a Swedenborgian. And there's lots you can find out online about us, though, and people who know the history even better than I do. But they've split a lot, and one of the biggest splits was right around the turn of the century. There were a lot of people in America who read Swedenborg and knew of Swedenborg at the time, but weren't necessarily signed up with a religious denomination. They just added to their spirituality with his thought. There was a big split, and a bunch of very conservative people with money left the main group to go do Swedenborgianism perfectly. And they were not like all those other people who are bad and wrong and doing Christianity wrong. Yeah, which is actually a dynamic in a lot of religions where I think it's based on trauma and or more nervous personalities just really need to feel good and safe and right. And so they're drawn to that way of doing religion, and without like therapy or trauma recovery, they will continue to feel best in something with lots of rules and lots of claims about being the perfectest and the best and the rightest. Anyway, that's information for those of you who have loved ones who cling to a group like that. There's lots of compassionate ways to understand it, even as it can be very challenging.
So you grew up in this, though?
I grew up in the ultra-conservative group, and all I knew was we were the best religion in the world and God's gift to humankind, and I had to do it perfectly. And not everyone in that grouping of Swedenborgians is like that or believes that hard, but that was certainly how I developed. And then around 40, had a big break in my faith and left that group. And only at that time could I give myself permission to study to be a minister, because I'd always wanted to be, but that group thinks women aren't capable of being ministers.
So what really, I guess, was the thing that broke for you? Like, we talk about the shelf in our
Yep.
group a lot. And I've said, it could be the 51st thing, and people will say, but why couldn't you go at 50? And you don't know. It just happened to be the 51st thing that helped you break and leave. So what was your sort of 51st thing that made you?
There were so many.
That led up to that.
Yes. It was
at least 50.
It was so hard to leave. And I do get judgy of people who are unhappy in it but don't leave. But then I have to remember how much it took for me to have to leave. Like, the pain of staying felt too terrible and inauthentic. I was very badly betrayed by the bishop at the time, in front of a friend, so that, like, the total crazy experience I almost wouldn't have believed happened. But because she was also there and saw it happen, it validated, wait, that really did happen. He really did just say those things to me and completely invalidate me and dismiss me. And this is...
You couldn't go back and tell yourself another story about that one.
Right, exactly. Which would have been, a not uncommon thing for someone with my personality profile and need to trust in the men that ran that group at the time. So it was the final nail in a coffin with lots of nails already. And I wrote a resignation letter. The only way to leave that church is to resign by letter to the secretary. So I did that, and I got a letter back basically saying, don't let the door hit you on the way out. It was not warm or, good wishes or anything.
So what for you kept you in that same space, though, going to a more liberal expression of it?
Well, there was a lot that I loved about it that I had learned. That group has tremendous art, incredible architecture. They do really good music and drama performances, and they do amazing pageants, and the music in the cathedral in my hometown was, I participated in it, and it was of a very high caliber. Often members of the Philadelphia Orchestra would come and play. And so I was really spoiled, and I loved, well, the hymns are really weird. I think it's similar to the Mormons, but we also sang in 4-part harmony, and I didn't realize how rare that was until I left. I think some Mennonites do, and it's just so fun. And I really, really miss that part of it. And the liberals are completely different. They haven't even revised their liturgy since 1950. And the group that I left does education. They basically are like a Catholic model. They don't have nuns, but they have priests, and they have a hierarchy, and they do schools. And by educating the kids in the religion, and they get religion all the time, and it's woven in sort of how to think about things. They call it distinctive new church education. And one of the things I didn't learn till later is the teachers that were trained up in that system didn't actually get state certification. They could only be employed within that church system. And if they left the church or, needed to move somewhere where they couldn't work in a school, they couldn't get another job without having to go back to school.
I didn't have a degree in education.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
I have a degree in religion. So I could be certified through the Association of Christian Schools International.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it? The standards change when religion's involved, and I am not a fan of that. I am glad that they've finally taken away automatic counseling rights from people who are ordained. They've recognized that just because you're an ordained person doesn't mean you are good at doing therapy with people. And I've seen some pretty awful quote unquote therapy done with people in pain, and just so glad they're not able to do that kind of abuse anymore. They have to get officially certified.
Yes, absolutely. And if I understand you, when you went to seminary, then you had a whole separate time that you were learning about the psychology part of it.
Yeah, this particular seminary, which is now called Martin Luther. They've just changed their name, so I can't just announce it and I don't remember it. But it's in Waterloo, Ontario, and if that should be enough information to find it. They were awesome, and they have a whole bunch of AMFT certification courses they have there as well, and a lot of the social work students come and get courses in the seminary because of that. And I've always loved psychology, so I took every counseling course I could while I was getting my theology degrees. So, yay!
What is your, your favorite part of Swedenborgianism that you kind of held on to and to say, yes, I still kind of want to, experience my faith around this belief system? I think sometimes we don't always take the whole pot, especially as we sort of grow and go to more liberal religious spaces.
Yeah.
It's like the one thing that kind of will tether someone, to stay in that space. What do you think is sort of the core part of that?
I learned by going to seminary that Swedenborgian's theology is a systematic theology. In other words, it sort of includes all of creation and science and how the universe works in one whole package and connects it to God. And God's purpose is to create humans who can go to heaven. And how that's understood is different because the conservatives have a very strong belief in hell and a fear of hell. And I've gotten to a place where I think hell is an awful lot of now as we learn how to be angels. And by angels, I mean that's what we become after we die. Sometimes we need a lot of education on the other side, but that's all part of the systematic theology. And even though I don't associate with the group that raised me, there's a lot in it that I love. And one of the core teachings that's never mentioned really with the conservatives is that God is for all people and finds a way to lead everyone, no matter where they are on the planet, no matter what religion they're in or not in. And that makes sense to me. I don't need to make people be just like me for them to get to heaven. And God doesn't have a tiny little narrow strip of things you have to believe. God works with us exactly as we are made to become the best us we can be. And that's how we'll be happiest forever. So the fact that it's not colonial, even though people have found a way to make it all about, recruiting people to believe exactly like we do. Swedenborg himself never intended it to become a formal religion. He He was making observations about the Christianity of his day, which was the early 1700s in Europe, hoping that people would take these new ideas and maybe heal some of the problems that existed in the Christianity he saw around him. Just that all paths are made by God to discover God, and the God that I believe in is so profoundly loving and wise and involved and completely capable of getting everyone to heaven who wants to go. There's just not any reason to be afraid. I still spend time being afraid because I'm human and I get worried about money and my health and different things. But one of my main tools for surviving in this crazy world is this fallback onto this faith in a God that really does care and take care of us and will see that everything comes out okay. And I figure even if I'm not right in that, it makes me a happier, more peaceful, more serene person to believe that. So I'm going to keep believing that.
I think it's a good way to go about it for sure. So I know you did pastor a church.
I did.
That you are now an independent celebrant. So do you miss having a congregation?
I do. I loved being a pastor, and I gave my whole heart and soul to it. I was an assistant to a pastor for many years up in a Canadian congregation, and then that came to an end, and I went back to school and was going to start getting my certification to be a therapist when I was called to a church in Maine. And it was a tiny little church, and they had never had a female pastor. And I loved the show The Vicar of Dibley, so that worked for me. Yep. And all of them were older than me, except maybe a mom and a daughter. They were younger than I was. But other than that, they were all in their 80s or 90s. And let me tell you, seniors in Maine are healthy. But again, they were all also fairly wealthy, so they could have privileges. And, I'm learning more and more to pay attention to the differences that wealth make in a person's life and how invisible those privileges can be. The job in Maine came to an end. They ran out of money. They wanted to cut me to half-time, and I couldn't afford to stay. And I was very lonely there. So I stepped away so they could find someone, and they have found someone who's a really good fit for them. I moved back to Canada to be where my kids are, and most of my life has been spent, and attended a Unitarian Universalist congregation there that worked really well for me. And there were like 7 other ex-ministers there, or not, no longer in practice. So that says a lot about how great that congregation was. I was just chatting with another minister, and it's like, once you're a chef, it's hard to go to someone else's restaurant because you spend a lot of the time critiquing the food and figuring out how you would have cooked it differently, unless they're really, so good. And then it's like, game recognizes game. But so also my husband he's not really a churchgoer, and I really understand he works all week. And so the last thing he wants to do is get dressed up and go somewhere else on a Sunday morning. He's a pretty smart agnostic. And he refers to my belief in God as, your benevolent God. And I just adore him, but he's not a churchgoer. And it's why my parents disapproved of him all those years ago when he started dating me, because he was an agnostic then. But he was so compassionate and gentle, and he didn't mock me or what I believed. And he would listen to me for hours, talk about the things I was wrestling with. And I wrestled a lot with angst and worry and fear of, not being perfect enough. And he just stuck with me. And, but his parents didn't approve of me, or his mom didn't. And my parents did not approve of him. And ultimately, I married somebody else. But now we're married.
And we are going to come back around to that, listeners.
Yeah.
So, Allison, now that we have hit the first of the two big no-no discussions, you mentioned Canada. So let's make it 2 for 2 and talk about politics and culture shock.
Right. So that's another huge shift. When I married a Canadian, I moved to Canada in my early 20s. I had been raised Republican, conservative Republican. It goes with a conservative religion in many ways. And Canada is not conservative in that way. The joke was, if you take the Democrats and go left, that's where you find Canadian conservatives, and then you keep going left from there. It's not quite true, but it's a funny joke. And so I moved up there, and I really believed that everyone who wasn't an American citizen just wished they were. That America was the best, and everyone who wasn't an American was just sort of holding out time until they could become an American. And that's embarrassing, very embarrassing, but that is what I believed. And didn't take me long to discover that wasn't true, that Canadians pretty much liked being Canadians and were proud to be Canadians, and universally are very interested in America and American culture, but don't necessarily want to become American. The big draw is the real or imaginary better off financially narrative that some people have, that if they move to America, they'll get paid better and not taxed so much. And that hasn't been my experience. Life's expensive, and you have to pay for it one way or another. And so either you pay for your health care through regularly measured, predictable taxes, and then it's all free, or you have to pay out of your nose all the time for something you may or may not need. When I moved to the U.S. to become a pastor, the way the poor church was able to get me was to make me a contract employee. So they weren't my employer, and I had to get my own health care and other things. So I was paying $475 a month for the privilege of maybe paying less if I actually needed any medical care. And it was such a shock to my system as a single self-employed person in 2014. And that was like the bottom of the barrel policy too. They had more expensive policies, but I didn't have money. So I went ultra cheap. And it just made me so angry, knowing that it doesn't have to be this way, and that you don't have to agonize whether you can afford to go to the doctor or afford to get that test, and that even medical care is something you might consider not getting because it's like, well, I see what this rash is about that's all over my back, or I pay my rent. Then you pay your rent and hope the rash isn't a terrible thing. And I have a cousin who's got some very scary stuff going on her face, and she won't go to the doctor because she doesn't have any health coverage. It could be cancer, and she could be dying of it, and she's not going to go because she can't pay. That's hard on me emotionally, and it doesn't even feel Christian. But,
In a Christian nation, quote unquote.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. How does the Canadian mindset work with that? Like, we tend to think of America as a Christian nation. Is there sort of a religious mindset in Canada?
Well, what's so interesting to me is as I began to see Canada as unique and having its own values and its own outlooks, I really got curious about, why it thought what it thought and how it came to make the choices it made. And some of it is who was elected and how much they got done while they had power. And Tommy Douglas, who was a Mennonite, and when he was in power in government, he's the one that implemented the universal health care. And a lot of their values, the peacefulness comes from Mennonite heritage, and the safety nets, the lower cost education, and a tremendous valuing of education came from the Christian culture, even though it's not overtly Christian. It's there because the people were valuing Christian things. And that's also true in these so-called secular Scandinavian countries. A great many of their social values came from their Lutheran heritage. And that's really interesting to me. And so when someone says, oh, but they're not Christian and they don't have faith, and I'm like, well, there's living faith, and then there's what you say you believe but don't live by. And I'll go with the living faith over what you say any day.
Absolutely.
But yeah, there's a lot of differences, and they do come from values, and those values work for me. Did you know that it's against the law to have drug commercials in Canada? And it's such a rude onslaught when I have been in Canada for a while, and then I come back and go to watch a show, and then there's these commercials for drugs, just ask your doctor for the blue pill. Right. And they weird me out. I am living in the States, and I've just been very, very, very disappointed with it because it is my country of heritage. But I haven't felt that proud of it lately.
Yeah.
And
I think a lot of us can say that.
Yeah. And I'd go back to Canada in a heartbeat if my husband, who I love, didn't have a job here in New York City.
So what is it that you miss most?
Oh, I lived in the Waterloo region in Ontario, and it has 2 universities. That particular region has tremendous social programs to help the homeless and addicts, just looking out for the most marginalized and the ones who've had the most trauma. And that really feeds my heart. And when I went to my best friend's graduation ceremony when she got her Master's of Social Work. And the first thing they started out with was, we want to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Six Nations peoples, that the whites appropriated from them, breaking their treaty. And that they include that in almost all their ceremonies. They start with that, acknowledging that we're on land that didn't belong to us. And it's not like we can just rip down all our buildings and give it back. At this point, I think that's sort of understood, but how do we make amends now is a really active part of the conversation in that crowd. Yeah, I'm an education girl. I grew up an education girl, and I'm still an education girl. And I guess I attribute the things I love the best about the Waterloo region is the high level of education and the tremendous art in the region.
Those are definitely things we've talked about on the show with James and I, that's such an important part of our life as well. So I can only imagine if we got to experience it in a space where it was really valued by that.
Yeah, and I mean, the U.S. has art and education too. But in Canada, at least for me, the just overall kindness in the attitudes is amazing. To live without fear of illness. That if you're sick or you need a test or you suddenly have emergency surgery needed, you just go to the doctor and you never pay a thing. You're granted a health card, and it's like your driver's license, and you just present that, and that's how they do bookkeeping with the government, and the doctors get paid, but you don't ever have to pay a thing. There's not a bill ever, and it's so peaceful. It's so worry-free, and I think that affects the level of kindness and ease in the general population up there. There's just not the same sort of angst and stress and angry dialogue and negative narrative. I don't know how else to describe it.
So as we mentioned a minute ago, not only do you currently reside in the States, but in the Big Apple. So kickstarting a business in the middle of a pandemic sounds quite challenging to me. Tell us about this business that is your passion and defies all the obstacles of starting a business in a pandemic.
Ridiculous. Well, talk about fundamental shifts. I mean, I was raised with the idea that women are to get married and have babies for God, and so I did that the best I absolutely could, though I didn't end up having the 14 children I ridiculously thought I wanted when I was in my teens. It was very much the old school model of the man earns the money and the woman does all the house care and child care. And I did that to the best of my ability, and I cooked and I sewed and I saved money by doing stuff myself and made homemade gifts and all the things that a traditional conservative Christian might be expected to do. And there's beautiful things about that. But when my husband of the time lost his job, and when other things didn't go well, and we were getting in debt, I had to find ways to earn money as well as doing all these other things. And that's been a challenging thing my whole life because of this feeling of, but I'm not supposed to have to, and I've already worked so hard. But it's the reality. I have to earn money. So how to do that's been a puzzle my whole life. The religion and psychology interdisciplinary, qualified me to say, do you want fries with that? And
yes, I relate.
Yeah. So, I had a friend who did organizing, and I said, what does it take to do organizing? And she said, well, if you kind of came out of the womb lining up your toys, you might be a natural organizer. And I definitely have a little bit of an OCD type stripe in me, and I'm so soothed by getting things cleaned up and tidy. And turns out, yes, I am a natural organizer, and I just started doing it years ago to supplement my income in my marriage, and then have done it in bits and bobs, but never made it official until this year. And partly because, the money that I earned wasn't being really declared, and some of that was out of necessity, but I believe in paying taxes, especially having lived in Canada. I absolutely believe in paying taxes and not trying to get away with sneaking it or hiding it or, feeling entitled to not have to, but everyone else should. I don't know how government runs without taxes, but so this was my effort to legitimize myself and declare myself. And I'd also come up with a logo that I love, and I thought, and a name that I love, and I didn't want them to get claimed by someone else. So I decided in June to register my business, which I couldn't really afford to do, and, start declaring myself as an official business. That's just been incredibly challenging because nobody wants to hire someone to come into their home and tell them how to dispose of their stuff, which is, understandable. And also, I'm such a hometown girl, such a homespun, unassuming. I don't fit in New York, where it's all glitz and glamour and hype and high end. And I keep getting the advice that I should charge $200 an hour and go after the really wealthy people. And that hurts my heart. I would be great if someone very wealthy wanted to pay me for what I'm really good at. But I don't want to only help people who have tons of money. Everybody needs this help. And that's why I charge on a sliding scale. But in New York, it's almost like people won't trust you if you're not really expensive. And so that's been a really interesting mindset to come up against, that I have to pretend to be all glitzy and glamoury and spend tons of money on my website and do classes and charge a lot of money for my classes on how to be organized. And I just love the hands-on work with the customers and watching their faces light up and watching the ease that comes into their bodies, and just the shame being released. Like, so many people have shame around their clutter or their mess or the stuff they just haven't had time to deal with. And the more people I work with, the more normal I see that it is that people have stuff they haven't had time to deal with. And part of what I do is help them come up with systems that fast track when they get home with a pile of stuff. They know that they put this here, this here, this here, this here, and then when they get back to it later, it's not buried under all the other things in one big heap, but in an already designated location. That kind of solution findings to help them find their own patterns that will help them deal with their stuff when they have the energy and time to try to. And I have so many repeat customers in my hometown, though of course no one's hiring me right now, understandably. Before the pandemic, my business that wasn't registered yet was really taking off. And I decided, well, in the pandemic, while I'm not working really hard, I'll at least register my business. And that's what it's been like. And I have imposter syndrome, and I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't know if I'm advertising right. But I had been getting steady income, and it had been growing, and I was starting to recruit other girls to work under my brand. And that was the model that I wanted to have, particularly to help people that didn't have another way to earn an income but would be really good at this. And the pastoral presence and the organized type of mind that it takes. And then the pandemic hit. And, it's just another sort of kneecap to my plans.
One of the focuses I do notice, the biggest focus in More Magic, is the link between what's going on outside and person's environment and what's going on inside a person's mind and heart, which is what you were just talking about a little bit. Tell us about your choice to make that focus an integral part of this business and not just say, okay, I'm going to charge $200 and clean crap up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would say it's because I was raised Swedenborgian and the particular way I absorbed that religion. One of my theology professors in the Lutheran seminary said, "Oh, I see. Swedenborgians are all about the insides." And I was like, she nailed it. I wouldn't have come up with those words, but that is exactly it. And it's always believing that there's stuff underneath and stuff underneath and stuff underneath. And the deepest stuff is the most spiritual stuff. And so the outsides and insides are linked, but they're never meant to be used to decide someone's going to hell. It's like there's lots of information in our environments and in our bodies and in our thoughts and in our feelings about what our needs are. But so many people approach self-exploration from an angle of fear. What if I find out I'm a terrible person? What if I find out I'm evil? What if I find out that it can't be fixed, or I can't be fixed, or I'm too broken? And just that's never true. And I love helping people release that kind of thinking and begin to get curious about looking inward and discovering all the amazing things about themselves. And that is mirrored in the organizing work, that as we clean up a space, we often find really beautiful things that they hadn't thought of as beautiful. And we'll put them in a place where they're featured visibly. And just doing that helps the whole space be lifted up. I was helping someone clean up her kitchen, and she had, piles of things all over her workspace. And some of them were stuck in old plastic containers that had had fruit in them once, or a big paper bag, or a plastic grocery bag. None of them are particularly attractive. And then, as I'm working with her, like about 3 days in, I discovered a cupboard full of beautiful bowls, like pottery bowls in different colors that matched her kitchen. And she's like, oh yeah, we use them if we have a party or something. And I said, you could use them now. And we pulled them out and we picked ones for each of the categories of things and put, some things that were not very messy and appealing looking in these beautiful bowls. And then the whole space felt amazing. And just that one tweak. And that's one of the many skills I've learned is, how to find the beautiful things and bring them out. And she didn't have to buy anything. She already had it. And I think that's true in our souls, that there's all kinds of beautiful things inside us that we don't even recognize as beautiful. And, when you do therapy, when you explore inward to see the things that you want to clean up, as you will also find the things that are incredibly beautiful. And so it's this connection between what's going on inside and what's going on outside. And that's why I love yoga, because for me, it is such an enormous metaphor for life and how I've lived my life. And so when I first got on the mat 12 years ago, just as a student, I spent the whole time judging myself and feeling inferior and being mad at my body that it couldn't do all these things. And of course, I'd never taught it to do those things. I'd never given it a chance to get good at those things. But no, my ego wanted me to already be great at all of it. And of course I wasn't. I was 48 and hadn't used my body much at all in the last bunch of years. My teacher said, how you are with yourself on the mat is how you are with yourself in the world. And how you are with yourself in the world will show up in how you are with yourself on your mat. And that was such amazing teaching. And so I realized I needed to start to practice compassion and kindness towards myself when I got on the mat. And that began to transfer to me being more compassionate and kind with myself out in the world. With all kinds of negative self-talk, I didn't even know what was going on. It had been there all the time. But it was so much a part of the background music I was used to that I hadn't even looked at it or noticed it or thought of it as a thing that maybe could be different. So those are just like pieces of how everything's connected and everything can give you useful information about what's going on and, how you might be able to tweak things to be more useful. And that's how I view everything, not good and bad. If I find this about you, you are bad. And if I find this about you, then you're good. It's never that. Everyone's good. Some people are incredibly wounded and we don't have to go into, are there evil people? Some people really need to believe there are evil people and I'm not going to argue with them. But in my encounters, everyone's good. And it's been true so far.
Very much that idea. There was this song by Lauryn Hill that I love. It's an oldie but a goodie, but it's Everything is Everything. It's kind of talking about that philosophy of we're not as disconnected and compartmentalized as we think.
Yes. Yeah. And something I've learned.
I love that this business, it seems like it's just about home improvement. It's really about, that's just where it starts. That's the entry point.
It's self-care. It's profound self-care. Yep.
Yeah. And speaking of beauty, let's talk about Sam and you.
Oh.
So you share your life in New York City with your husband, Sam.
Yeah.
And you and Sam have had quite the path to your life together now. Perhaps more of a circle
yeah.
than a path. So let's hear your love story.
So we were in the same high school class. My Christian school that I went to had a boarding school. I lived in the town, so I wasn't in the dormitories, but kids came from around the world to be in this high school. because their parents were adherents of the religion. So Sam was sent there and never bought it. He didn't, he kind of knew how to think before he ever got there. And he just thought it was all kind of quaint and funny, and kept his head down and his mouth shut and made friends, and was absolutely going to shake the dust from his feet and never come back as soon as he graduated high school. There were dances that were required, and the boys were required to take dates. And so for the very last dance of our high school year, he decided to ask me. And he said he hadn't kind of noticed me before, and then he looked up and saw me and decided he wanted to invite me to the dance, and he did, and I was thrilled. A boy actually asked me to a dance, and he was funny and interesting. I didn't really know him that well. And one thing I am good at is compassionate listening and valuing the input of the other, and I also just really wanted to be liked by a boy. We spent the whole night talking, walking around and talking. It was a June evening, and it was, a lovely, cool temperature. And we just walked and talked and talked and walked and walked and talked. We didn't, I don't think, dance at all or pay much attention to anything that was going on inside the ballroom. And then the dance was over, and he walked me home. And I found out later, like, we sat on the porch swing and talked and talked and talked and talked. And then eventually he needed to go back. So we said goodnight, but I was very, very good and pure. So I didn't kiss him. Like, no way. Just, said goodnight. Probably didn't even shake hands, just like, good night. Yeah. And then so apparently he had a curfew, and he had deliberately just let it pass because it was the last night he was in the dormitory. And he went, and he was the valedictorian the next morning. So he comes in with his hands in his pockets, whistling, like an hour and a half or 2 hours past curfew. And they were waiting up for him, and they gave him detention and made him scrub toilets right then and there in the middle of the night, because they needed to prove a point or something. It just, yeah. So, and I found this out later. And I found out later that he fell in love with me that night. And one of the things I treasured about him was he really, really cared about me unconditionally. And I was so used to judgment, just judgment and gossip and gossip and judgment and fear, and messages always about what to be afraid of and what other people were doing wrong and how it was wrong. And, the gossiping about who was wrong and why was sort of how they taught me not to be and do those things. And so I was just like wired to pay attention for any way someone was going to disapprove of me so that I could preemptively not do it, right? And none of that energy came from him ever. And so, of course, I loved spending time with him. Plus, he's so funny. And I say to this day, like, I could never imagine him. I have written a romance novel, and I could just never dream up a human like Sam. He's so quirky and so different than me, and his mind works in such ridiculous ways. He makes me laugh all the time. And even in high school, a lot of people would tell him he should do stand-up, and he was never interested in it. And I think it's just because he's a very private person. So he doesn't, like, can be as funny as he wants, but that doesn't mean he has to do stand-up or even be a comedy writer, So I'm mostly the sole recipient of his delightful conversation, and just feel so lucky all the time. And every once in a while, I'll put something on Facebook saying, Sam just said this, and get, all kinds of delighted responses because he's just so funny. But I also was so engineered toward finding a good religious husband. So I kept telling him, well, we're not dating. I love spending time with you and we're good friends, but we're not dating. And then I'd wait, for someone like the real guy to ask me out. And try to distance myself from Sam so that the guy who was going to marry me would ask me out. And every once in a while, a guy would ask me out, but, none of them were Sam. And so I kept going back and spending time with him until everybody thought we were dating. And I kept, I think officially I even broke up with him, because I really needed people to not think we were together so that the right guy would date me. And eventually Sam proposed, and I did what I was supposed to do. I took it to my parents because by the religious teachings of that sect, my parents would know better than I would who would be a good husband for me. And they didn't approve of him. They didn't want me to marry him. So I ended up saying no. And I can take some ownership of that too. There was, what I told him was, I can't say yes right now, maybe in the future. And I had no idea how prescient that was. That I actually would say yes way in the future.
I think he took it very, very seriously.
Yeah, well, he didn't ever end up marrying anyone, though he did date a bunch of people and had relationships and has not been deprived of key experiences. And all of that I'm grateful for. And we'd have class reunions and we'd end up hanging out together and I'd have just as much fun in his company as before. And yet, no, he wasn't someone I was interested in, well, especially not when I was married. And so it was platonic. The whole time it was platonic. And when my marriage to the Canadian finally just was undeniably dead and I left him, it was still years before I reconnected with Sam. And it took that long, I think, for my psyche to be ready to be a good partner to him because I had so many old ideas I needed to get rid of. And I felt incredibly vulnerable. Like the bottom had just dropped out from under me because he absolutely loved me unconditionally. He really had never stopped. And I didn't know if I loved him as much as he loved me, and that didn't feel good. And that was, I got really curious about what does that mean? And can I let him love me? And is that okay? And of course, once I relaxed into that, of course I love him. I always have, but I didn't know what it was supposed to look like. And it wasn't this angsty thing where you're always trying to win approval and you don't know when he's going to be uninterested in you and you have to win his approval back. It's just it's not that. And that's what I'd done my whole life. And after I divorced my husband and tried dating, I kept attracting the same profile until I just gave up because it's oh man, I'm too broken. All I keep finding is this same dynamic and I don't want this dynamic anymore. So it stopped and then ran into Sam. Within 4 days, I knew I wanted to marry him.
Wow.
37 years after meeting him.
Sure. But there's something to be said for that about being so comfortable in your own skin and
yes.
knowing yourself. And also you set this intention of, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And putting that out into the universe that you did attract the right person back.
Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful. And I just wonder about this idea. We have talked about this before with just the whole idea of, I guess, loving someone more or less. I have thought about that a little bit and wonder if it's not so much more or less as much as just we don't necessarily love each other the same way.
Yeah.
Because we're individual humans.
Well, right. And what do we mean by love? And there's feelings and emotional signatures and yeah. And I've always loved him, like from the beginning, but I didn't know it wasn't romantic. I wasn't sexually attracted to him consistently, just occasionally. And, and I expected to just be swept off my feet like a romance novel. And I expected this guy to be, tall and handsome and have lots of money and Sam's tall And I think he's handsome, but he consistently calls himself a funny looking and says he's a card-carrying member of the funny looking club. And that's his humor. A very poignant moment when we were talking about getting married, and he said, I just don't want to feel like you're always looking over my shoulder for someone better. And I realized like how obviously I was doing that all the time back in the day. And I'm sad about that. But it was my programming, and I was doing the best I could to do the program perfectly so I could have babies for God, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so much of that wasn't necessarily Sam being in his words, because I don't think he's a funny looking
You're right.
person.
No, you've seen pictures. Yeah.
Yes, no, not at all. But, you know, in his words, I'm not even sure it was, you know, it's not like so much of that even in your mind as much as what you were saying earlier of from the get-go, he was a thoughtful agnostic.
Yeah.
The way that you grew up, the way I grew up, you didn't marry outside.
No.
Because you would be unequally yoked.
Right. That's absolutely, yeah. Marry in the church was the family motto. And if you want to know.
If you didn't, they would make fun of you and call you are you missionary dating?
Right. In your. No, they actually have a special term for marriage love. And I call the denomination I left the salvation by heterosexual marriage alone denomination. And, you know, if you're single, you're just not married yet. And if you're a lesbian, you're horribly misguided and need to be fixed, you know. And
have it met the right man.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh. And so my sister had to go through a lot of that kind of thinking, and is, for the most part, her wife is not at all acknowledged by the conservatives. Sure. And it's very hard.
Is your sister still in the church?
No, she left ages ago. I have two sisters, and the sister I'm close to is not in the church and is married to a woman and is wonderful. And the other sister is married to a conservative minister and is one of the most, like, the denomination I left isn't conservative enough by her standards. And I can't not love her. She is my older sister. She has a lot of charm and a lot of appeal. And I think she just desperately wants to feel good enough and lovable. But the things she believes, I think, are harmful. And I just can't be around her much. So
but you did have the joy of marrying your sister to her partner, didn't you?
I did that wedding. Yep. And then the other sister unfriended me on Facebook for a long time. Yeah.
Oh, that's hard.
Yeah. You know, but there's something.
When did Facebook become our
determiner
of relationships?
Well, how authentic do you want to be? And how picky about who are your safe friends? And that is a thing that Facebook has highlighted.
It's true. I'd love to hear what you might say to your younger self and what you might remind yourself of when you're older.
Which I already am.
Older than you are.
Yes.
That's based on the present learning you're having right now.
I would say you are worthy. You have done nothing wrong. You're going to be fine. Just keep showing up and being the loving person that you are. Keep forgiving yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself. Do your best to let go of expectations, though that's really hard to do. And instead be curious about what does happen and does end up being true. And if you can't, forgive yourself. Being human isn't easy. And just radical self-compassion and not being afraid of seeing your weak areas, because they don't mean you're going to hell or are a bad person at all. Everybody's got weak areas, and we have forever to keep growing and getting stronger and becoming the person we want to be. So try to take a deep breath and relax. You're fine. How's that?
That's a perfect place for us to end. Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome.
We use many resources for the show. If you'd like to learn more about the Swedenborgian Church, they can be found on the web at www.swedenborg.org. As always, we'll have these links in the show notes and on the socials.
We were delighted to have Alison Moore joining us today. To contact More Magic Organizing, Clearing and Organizing, Inside and Out, check them out on the web, Facebook, and Instagram at More Magic Organizers, and you can email directly using allison@moremagicorganizing.com. For our listeners, we'll also have these links in the show notes and on the socials.
Please subscribe to the podcast, rate and review us on Apple Podcast or the platform of your choice. Your feedback means a lot to us. It allows others to find us more easily and helps us to know more about the content you're looking for.
Now that you've heard from us, we want to hear from you. Facebook us on the Fundamental Shift podcast page. Tweet us at FunShiftPod. Instagram us at fun.shift.pod. Find us on the web where you can also comment on our blog at funshiftpod.com. Email us at funshiftpod@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail or text us at 704-665-7473.
Tune in next week as we talk about the holidays, a not-so-jolly time for some. We're in this shift together, and we'll have resources for those of you who, like me, often struggle during this season of joy. Until then, remember folks, shift happens,